Okay, keep your eyes closed.
Okay.
I want to show you my first ever painting.
All right.
Okay. Open your eyes.
Oh, that's a lot of colors and shapes.
So be honest. What do you think?
Well, I like how if you switch to Geico, you could save hundreds of dollars on car insurance.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
Yeah. Here, why don't I hold your paintbrush while you call them?
Geico, because saving 15% or more on car insurance is always a great answer.
Blog Talk Radio.
Hello, and welcome to Reconnect and Reclaim You. I'm your host, grief awareness and mindful living specialist, Teri Pugh, and we're broadcasting to you tonight from Nashville, Tennessee, where it has been a little drizzly all day, but otherwise absolutely beautiful. Want to give you our call-out number tonight. Put my glasses on so I can read. If you are wanting to call in and listen tonight, you'll dial 1-805-292-0349. You can listen there to the show live. If you want to call in and ask a question, you're going to dial that same number and press 1, and you'll be put into the mix on our dashboard, and we will get you worked in. Tonight, actually, before we get into who the guest is tonight, I want to share, as I always do, that the intention of Reconnect and Reclaim You is to present people with tips and tools and resources that, you know, they may be familiar with and some they may have never heard of before. So some things are going to seem comfortable and, you know, cozy to you, and other things might invite you to stretch just a little bit outside of that comfort zone. So wherever you are on your journey, I hope that you're able to take something away from each of the shows, particularly tonight because it's fabulous, and put it in your pocket and, review it as needed when needed. So with that all said, I would love to introduce to you my guest tonight is John Christian Phifer, and he is going to talk with us about natural burial, which is just something that probably not many people have heard of, but it's a fascinating topic. So welcome, John Christian.
Thank you so much for having me, Teri.
It's a pleasure to have you. Tell us a little bit about yourself and about this hard work that you do.
Well, I tell you, I guess it was about 15 years that I'd spent in the conventional funeral industry. When I stepped away, I had come to a point where in the industry I needed to remove myself for personal belief reasons. I was in the industry for, like I said, around 15 years, and when I stepped away, I did it primarily because I wanted to step back and reflect on the industry's practices and look into ways that the industry's practices could be bettered or modified. I felt like the industry was rushing people through the process, and their experience was lacking. I have created in Nashville a sustainable funeral care company. I call it Life by Life, Sustainable Funeral Care. And we focus on natural burial, and we focus on home-based funeral practices. And we really reach out to individuals in need as they approach us and help them through the transitional time in a family's life when they've experienced death.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. So, how does the process environment? How does that work?
Well, we are focused primarily on sustainability, which is environmental sustainability. So, when looking at funeral practices currently today that are in practice, you will find generally people are offered two options at the end of life. One is to be cremated, and one is to be embalmed or casketed and buried in the ground. The other options that people have that nobody really talks about are natural burial and conservation burial. The two basically hone in on a green and sustainable practice that takes the human remains and basically uses them as a tool to further protect endangered wild spaces, habitat, land from urban sprawl, you name it. Natural burial is the process of burying human remains in the ground without embalming, without the use of a metal casket or a concrete vault, and in a manner so that the ecosystem where the remains are buried is nourished and protected.
Okay, so folks that say, I wanted to do this, I wanted to be buried naturally, can I just be buried in a normal cemetery?
Generally, you cannot be buried just in any old cemetery. I was a part of a large funeral home chain, and I was the manager for that particular company before I left the funeral industry to start afresh in sustainability and environmentalism. And the cemetery that I was at, we didn't have a section where someone could be buried without a casket or without a vault. We didn't have an option for anything like that. You know, we had all, speaking from as a licensed funeral director and embalmer, in the funeral industry, we had heard of green burial, and we knew what the practice was about. We knew that it was an effort to change from practices that were harming not only the practitioner but harming the environment, to switch over and actually adopt practices that help sustain the environment, whether that's using a biodegradable casket or providing a family more options when it comes to recycled paper products for their register book and their stationery when a death occurs out of visitation or whatever, when you can use sustainable products in lieu of products that are more harmful to the environment. You know, that's one step of green burial and sustainability in the practices of what actually occurs in the conventional industry right now. In a conservation cemetery or in a natural burial ground, what actually happens is the body is not embalmed, because generally when a body is embalmed, formaldehyde is used, and we all know, from as you know anything, when you're shopping for home products, you see the tag formaldehyde free. Well, why is it important? Because it's a carcinogen, and those things are not good for the environment. So when you have an embalmer or an employee at a funeral home who has to administer formaldehyde to the deceased remains of the human body, there's potential for harm there. And then with the use of the carcinogen formaldehyde in the embalming fluid, you know, that practice is also not good for the environment if it were to escape beyond the person that it's meant for when embalming. And a lot of companies have really tried to embrace the whole movement and capture business from the green burial movement, with several of the larger embalming chemical companies within the funeral industry actually taking on the charge to create formaldehyde-free embalming fluids and create fluids that are more biodegradable in fashion. And that's great. And I really, really applaud the champions within the funeral industry that are there to try to create changes like that within an industry that has been changeless for so long.
Well, and along those lines, with the reality is, like you said, when someone passes away, transitions, dies, a family really has a very short span in order to get everything done. And sometimes, if they're anticipating a death from an illness or something, then they can, for lack of a better word, get their ducks in a row. But still, at that time, there's coroners that have to be called, and there's all kinds of steps that have to be taken, pretty hastily, you know. And so how does this natural burial, how does this process involve the family? Because I know when my late husband passed away, he passed away here in our home, and, you know, immediately the coroner was called and he was out of the house, and I noticed one thing was no longer was he less, he was the body.
Right.
You know, he just suddenly, you know, 54 years of being known as less, and then he was just known as the body.
Yes.
And this thing happened within the dynamic, of course, and I'm not tooting my own horn, but having experience in grief, I kind of can sit back and watch the tumblers kind of line up with people, and people shift into this mode of the Cadillac line of everything. It's like, I've got to do the best. I've got to give them the best burial. I've got to whatever. So what part does the families play in this? If, you know, like, walk me through a process.
Okay. Well, let me first say that the best thing a family can do, or the best thing someone who is contemplating their death in the future, or someone that is planning for their estate, or what will happen when they die, or someone that has children, or any family, the best thing that they can do is actually just first start by having a conversation with their family, being open and honest about what their wishes are and what they want for the end of their life, what they want it to look like from top to bottom. And, you know, it's really hard when somebody, it's hard for a family to askew from what someone's wishes are. I've met with many, many families in my career, and anytime someone says, well, that's what he wanted, or, well, that's what he wanted, you know, I've never seen a family really go against that. It can happen, sure, it can happen if there's other dynamics going on in the family, but generally a family honors the wishes of someone that has left a plan. And generally what happens is they will go into, after the discussion, they will get even deeper into it. They will talk about what kind of casket they want. They will talk about what kind of expense they want to put into this, whatever they've planned. And it really does help the family in the long run just by having those options and knowing what the wishes of the loved one are. Because if they don't, like you said, they go to the car lot and they want to buy the Cadillac. And their emotions are in a place where they're not as stable, and they want to do everything they can one last time for this person. And a lot of times they overspend.
Yeah. What is a ballpark, or can you share with us what a ballpark of just a traditional, you know, corner to the dirt on top of the grave? What does that run these days?
Generally, for someone that is someone that passes away, goes to a funeral home, there's a casket, there's a vault, there's a visitation, there's a funeral, and there's a burial, and then everything's done. Generally, the National Funeral Directors Association will tell you that the average cost for everything prior to the burial or prior to the cemetery cost is just a little over $7,000, including when you get to the cemetery, you can add in that general average of about $4,000. So total, with a funeral and a burial, the traditional way that we've all seen it, is right at around $11,000, including your funeral expenses and your cemetery or burial expenses. So that's the national average right now. Some people choose below that. They'll choose something that's less expensive, or they'll do some services that are not as in detail, and some will go much further beyond that, and they will spend a lot more money on all of the bells and whistles. So again, that is just an average of the cost.
Wow. Okay. So that's a lot of money.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, there's probably a lot of people out there saying, well, what about cremation? What does that cost? Well, generally, you can acquire a cremation, again, depending on who's providing the cremation to you, who the service provider is, anywhere from hundreds of dollars to several thousands of dollars. It just depends. I've seen it within Nashville range from anywhere from $700 to $5,000, and that's for the same exact type of cremation, just minimal bare bones direct is what the industry will term it, direct cremation. It just depends on who the provider of the actual cremation is and what their actual overhead costs are, because they factor all of their overhead costs directly into what you have to pay for their service.
Wow. So, this is not a...
It's kind of like the idea of a hotel. Pardon my interruption, but it's kind of like the idea of a hotel. If you go to Opryland Hotel, which is one of the larger bells and whistles hotel, your room is going to be a lot more expensive. If you go to a 5-room hotel that's much smaller and not as tricked out, you're going to get everything for a much lesser cost.
Wow. Okay. Well, and I received a question this week, and you actually touched on it just a few minutes ago, so I wanted to kind of round that up. The question was, when a loved one has when they have their wishes laid out, but they don't write it out and really, make it clear, what can families do to kind of take that almost obligatory kind of grief, or to make everything good one last time, or to get their own personal opinions out of the way, because some people believe that you need to be vaulted, and you absolutely have to be, and if you're not, then it's not a proper burial, and what are some of the things that people can do? And you said it perfectly, which is talk, because the reality is death. We're all going to die. Let's just, spoiler, we're all going to die. So, and that said, planning it out doesn't mean, I think some people think planning out the funeral is kind of like the whole black cat and walking under a ladder thing. If you plan out the funeral, then you better walk around in bubble wrap because you fix and get nailed. That's so not the case. I planned my funeral out. As a single mom, I planned my funeral out probably 10, 15 years ago. And, I've joked often, and it's probably in really bad taste, but I'd like to kind of have a dry run of it because it's going to be great. It's, the music is the music that I like. The things that are shared are the things that, it's all me. It's not in the hands of someone that loves me and that is finding themselves in this really emotional roller coaster ride left to try to do it right for me. So the question that came through, was how do we handle that? And again, it goes back to just honoring the emotions, that you have as an individual, but also not letting those emotions dovetail over into verbal or written last wishes that your loved ones have had, because you stand the chance of going against your loved one's last wishes somewhere down the line, of having regret around that, because you can't go back and do it over again once you've done it.
Right.
And a question that they had posed for you was, when did the process of embalming or using chemicals in the body, when and how did that come around? Because, in the Gunsmoke days, we didn't embalm people. We did just what you're talking about with natural burial. So when was this big shift?
It actually occurred in America the first time.
No.
No, a historic or an ancient form of embalming was actually done in Egypt many, 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 many eons ago.
Right.
For wealthy individuals that were placed in the tombs there, and the reason it was done was to preserve the body intact so that it could be used in the afterlife. But in America, when it first occurred, was actually on the battlefield during the Civil War. And the reason for embalming, the reason it became a necessity at that time, was because we didn't have an interstate system, and we didn't have planes and trains and different methods to get us around the country. So when a soldier died away from home, they were basically placing the deceased soldiers on wagons, and they were transporting them home. But by the time they got the soldier home, decomposition had taken the remains to a degree that the family was unable to have proper closure or spend any time with the remains. So I believe it was Aaron Burr, my history professor in Mortuary College, would be very proud of that. I believe it was Aaron Burr who was the gentleman that was first photographed on the Civil War battlefield embalming human remains for the first time. He was obviously noted as one of the individuals who helped create the practice. It was actually the first embalming was actually done there on the battlefield, and they used arsenic as opposed to formaldehyde. Things have changed, and formaldehyde proved to be a much better fixative and preservative over time than arsenic ever was. But it still isn't good for the environment, nor was arsenic. But I tell you, that's when it really actually took off. And it wasn't long after that President Lincoln was actually assassinated. And his funeral was the largest funeral in American history, and probably will be the largest funeral ever in American history. He was actually embalmed. And when the American people saw the president on the train as it traveled around the country, his embalmed remains, they became glamorized to a degree, and they saw it as a luxury item, and they wanted it as a practice for their end of life practices, and that's kind of how it developed. People that built caskets were generally furniture store makers, cabinet makers, furniture store owners, casket makers, and they provided generally just a casket to a family, and they would have the funeral at home, and they would dress casket. No embalming was generally performed. But after President Lincoln's funeral, people started asking for embalming. And people started learning about embalming and learning how to do it. And there began schools for training, and it grew and it grew, and it became a commodity. And the individuals who were practicing the embalming, the early embalmers, and the early cabinet makers that were building caskets, they kind of got together and they decided, we're doing all of this. Why don't we make a profitable business out of it? And we will create something that people need, that people are asking for, and we'll start profiting from it, and we'll create this industry. And that's how the industry grew. It never was realistically that anybody needed embalming, because it's not a necessity to have anybody embalmed. It's just what everybody else is doing, and it's what everybody else did. It does, in certain circumstances, help when a body is embalmed. I'm not going to lie, I'm an embalmer at heart and by trade. And there are certain circumstances when embalming can play a vital role in the way a family says goodbye. But for the majority of cases, embalming is not necessary. And embalming it is noted that it is not good for the environment. So does that help answer your question? How did we start with embalming, and how did we get to where we are now with the modern funeral industry?
It does, and I think that my listener that sent that in will make tons of sense. And so, but you said something that if you can share a little bit more about, there are certain times that embalming is good. Mm-hmm. So I know that when you said that, I could hear the bing, bing, pings in people's heads. When is that? Because what would make my death any different? Mm-hmm. That kind of thing. So,
well, the practice of embalming by a trained professional embalmer can come in really beneficial, and a family can really, for lack of a better word, reap the benefits of an embalmer's practice. When a traumatic death has occurred, or when a death has occurred away from home and the family is not able to see the body, mm-hmm. similar to the reason it started in the first place on the Civil War battlefield, when mm-hmm. these soldiers were unable to get home for their mother to say goodbye to them.
Right.
That's generally, those are the cases where embalming really comes into play, and it proves to be more beneficial for families.
Awesome. Now, so going back to, if we're not in a cemetery lined up in uniform order mm-hmm. next to our neighbor, mm-hmm. Where I'm going to be cremated, but say I were going to be natural burial, and where would I be? Where would my remains be laid, and how would they be? How am I prepared? Who prepares me? Who gets me ready? How do I get there? What's that whole thing? Because I know that people are wondering, who does all that?
Right.
Do we have options?
You do.
Awesome.
Your options currently for natural burial, and a lot of people always ask too, can I be buried on my own land? Can I be buried on my own land? Or people generally will say, I thought that was illegal, or I didn't think you could do that. You can be buried on your own property. You just have to go through the proper paperwork documentation for the deed as a property owner, and you need to make note with the health department that a burial is made on the actual property. It's not proper to just start allowing people to come be buried on your land randomly. When I say on your own property, it's mm-hmm. property that you actually physically own.
Right.
And that's kind of how small family cemeteries got their start. Mm-hmm. Small family cemeteries were for family members. It wasn't for family members and then everybody at church too, And then, of course, churches began opening their own cemeteries attached to their religious organization. But there have been natural burial grounds that have been opened. There aren't any currently in Nashville. The closest is in Ramsey. It's actually in Westminster, South Carolina. I apologize for being
anyway.
And it's called Ramsey Creek. Their cemetery has been there since 1998, and it is a natural burial ground that is deemed a conservation burial ground. In other words, conservation burial is a natural burial ground when a conservation easement has been set up to control how the property is protected forever. So it can never be developed. It can never be changed. It can never be a cemetery. It's naturally a preserve where the ecosystem is first and foremost in the developer's mind. Here in Nashville, like I said, we do not have a natural burial ground yet. Again, options would be burial on private land or in a churchyard cemetery. A lot of the churchyard cemeteries do not require a casket or a vault. Some may. That's something, again, when you have this open conversation with family members, that's something that will come up. Where is the burial going to take place? Where can a burial like this occur? But another thing to keep in mind, and something that I'm very passionate about, is a project that I am currently a part of. We in 2013 established a nonprofit organization Our founder is Becca Stevens of Thistle Farms in Magdalen, and she is an Episcopalian priest here in Nashville, very well known. And we are developing a conservation burial ground where natural burial can occur. And we have currently identified several tracts of land that we are very interested in for the potential of becoming a conservation burial ground or a place where natural burial can occur with no embalming, no casket necessary, no vault necessary. And our nonprofit is called Larkspur Conservation. And you can find us online at larkspurconservation.org. We're several years out from actually having an open gated cemetery available and ready for public use, but it is in the works. We are developing it a little bit every day. There's something that comes up, and we get one step closer to our goal. So I'm very, very optimistic about this project, and it's something that's very much needed for the Nashville and the Tennessee community. To drive to South Carolina, granted it's just over the Tennessee state line. It's not as far as what it seems, but
Right.
To drive there for a lot of people, location is important. They want something that's closer to home, and they also want something, a natural open green space like the conservation burial ground affords in their own community, something that they can enjoy.
Okay. So with that said, when we're talking about a conservation area, for people who aren't familiar with that, because I know you and I have had a couple of conversations, can you tell me a little bit about what that environment might look like? Because I think some people, because of the familiarization that they have with cemeteries, think of big area,
Mm-hmm.
manicured grass,
Mm-hmm.
and headstones.
And plastic flowers.
And
Don't forget the plastic
Don't
flowers.
forget those plastic flowers, because they're there, honey. They are there. So what would this place look like?
Well, the cemetery in South Carolina that I've visited many times is actually most resembling a nature preserve or state park area that you could go to go on a hike or to be in nature or to reconnect with God. It's a beautiful, serene place, no upright headstones. Any headstone or marking on the grave is from natural stone. There is no plastic flowers. There are no outside plantings on any of the graves or in the cemetery at all. If you could imagine walking in your favorite natural area, whether that's somewhere where you grew up as a child or somewhere here in Nashville that's your favorite state park or a natural area like Radnor Lake,
Mm-hmm.
that's exactly what this type of cemetery looks like.
Okay.
It doesn't resemble a cemetery. A lot of people actually shy away from using the term cemetery at all when talking about a natural burial ground,
Mm-hmm.
because cemetery evokes thoughts of something completely different.
Right. Okay, so I die.
Mm-hmm.
And I've chosen natural burial. So does my family take me to a funeral home, or how does all that work?
What happens when, if most recently, a family that I helped, they had some time to plan ahead. They had discussed their wishes. The dying person had requested natural burial, and the family took charge at the end of death, and the body never left the home.
Okay. Now that's different.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure what great insight on their part, though, because when you take charge, or ownership of your loved one, then you get to care for them.
Right.
That's a very beautiful thing.
They chose, as a part of his wishes, not to outsource his death to the hands of a stranger.
Mm-hmm.
They coordinated with the hospice agency that they were utilizing the services of, They made them aware of what their wishes were, and when the death occurred, his body remained at home, and they never transferred the body to the funeral home. They kept him there so they could have the time that they needed without any rush. They could do everything on their own schedule. I coached them through the process of how to maintain and care for the body over the time that he was at home. That's a common concern for people without any kind of refrigeration. You know, what do you do? So we walked them through that process, and they actually drove him themselves to Ramsey Creek Preserve in South Carolina, and the burial took place the following morning. So he was at home probably about 24 hours before they left to go to Ramsey Creek in South Carolina. Now, there are numerous funeral homes in this city, and generally you will find in every one of them wonderful funeral directors that are there and waiting to help people in need. I feel like the funeral industry really gets a bad rap a lot of times, and it's sensationalized in the media. And sure, there's been bad situations, but generally, every experience, if you ask somebody, well, what did you think of your experience? Well, it's pretty good. It wasn't that bad, obviously they're not like jumping up and down with joy like they just bought a new car because the death has occurred. Right. But just to say that there are many, many, many willing funeral directors able to help in certain circumstances. This particular family that I had helped used a small funeral home here in Nashville, and they had actually only helped the family with paperwork. Some of the paperwork, some of the things that the family didn't understand, the funeral home helped sort out. The funeral home was there and ready to help with any transportation needs as well if they needed. In the instance where they didn't want to drive their father necessarily to the cemetery, the funeral home was there to be able to do that too. So generally, people will be able to rely on any funeral home here in Nashville. What I would encourage you to do, though, to all of the listeners out there who may be planning a natural burial or want some form of a green funeral, I would suggest that you speak with your local funeral director, the one that you trust, the ones that you're more familiar with. Call them all if you want. Whatever makes you feel more comfortable. And ask them what they're able and capable of doing when it comes to natural burial and green funerals.
Okay. So in a traditional funeral, we're in, is it aluminum, steel, metal, the casket?
It can be a range of different materials. I've seen plastic caskets. I've seen metal caskets from steel, bronze, copper, stainless steel. Okay.
So in a natural burial, what's the body transported to the site, to the grave site in, and what happens there?
Generally, the body is wrapped in a shroud or blanketed.
Okay.
And the body is sometimes placed in a casket prior to. Keeping in mind that if you use a casket in a natural burial ground, it does have to be in a biodegradable casket or receptacle. It can be made of cardboard, it can be made of wood, but it has to be biodegradable. One of the things when we were talking about metal and steel and copper and bronze caskets, there's also a lot of wood caskets out there that are wood that will break down but are not necessarily biodegradable and sustainable. Those caskets would be caskets like exotic mahogany caskets and rare and endangered hardwood. So in choosing a casket for natural burial, less is more. Okay. For sure. Okay. And a lot of people really realistically will opt for using a shroud or a family quilt, something of that nature, to actually wrap the body in for transportation and for burial.
Okay. Good deal. So how does a family, once and I've seen the images of a graveside service,
Mm-hmm.
and they are absolutely beautiful.
Mm-hmm. It's
really, really beautiful, very intimate. You can just feel the love. You really can. I mean, they're amazing.
Mm-hmm. Not only from the people around you, but from nature and God.
Absolutely.
It is a scenic, beautiful experience when you lay someone to rest that way.
And so, how do you find your loved one once you've laid them to rest in a natural burial cemetery?
Okay, that's a good question. Although when you walk into a natural burial ground, you may not see headstones, there are identifiers in place to be able to track where people are buried. We use a system in a natural burial ground where GPS coordinates are used. There's a backup system where a grid system, similar to that of a conventional cemetery but much more open, would be used, where that you can go out and actually measure across and find pins where surrounding a grave where you would be able to identify exactly where remains had been buried. So there are several systems in place, just like the systems in a conventional cemetery, if not a step further with GPS.
Nice. So really, natural burial is just going back to the way it was originally.
Exactly. It's the exact same thing that our great-grandparents experienced. I mean, this is nothing. It sounds new, but this is nothing new.
Until you just said that, I didn't even connect those two.
Mm-hmm.
But it's true.
This is what our family members did, and family members not that long ago. If I talk to my grandmother right now, she can tell me stories about how my great-grandmother was in the living room and where the casket was, and and they went less than a mile to bury her in the family cemetery.
Mm-hmm.
And how much different is that environmentally in comparison to what we're doing today?
Right. Well, and it stands to reason that at the rate, I'm no mathematician, but at the rate of population that we have and the grounds in which we are, using so much space for those much-needed malls and condos,
Mm-hmm.
then cemeteries. So space is an issue.
A lot of people are very concerned with space when it comes to end of life. They think that burial is foolish and wasteful because it takes up space. Now, I want everybody to kind of open their mind for just a minute and imagine how it can be beneficial to use burial as a tool to save land.
Right.
And that's what we do with conservation burial in a natural burial ground. We actually use burial to save land. So let's say you were to pass away, Teri,
mm-hmm.
and your family comes and they say, we want to purchase a grave in your natural burial ground. And they buy a grave, which is, by the way, on average, the total cost is $3,000 across the United States. That's the average for burial in a conservation or natural burial ground. And that includes the opening and closing, and that includes the marker and everything.
Wow.
$3,000. Let's just say that they came and they gave us, our nonprofit cemetery, $3,000 for all of the things that you would need to have a cemetery that was, to have a grave space in our cemetery forever. We would use that money to cover the immediate cost for what we needed to do for your family. The money that was not used goes into an endowment care fund to help sustain the cemetery forever in perpetuity.
Mm-hmm.
That means forever. And the money that was not put into the endowment fund would be used to save more land. So a friend of mine, Dr. Billy Campbell, which is the founder and owner of Memorial Ecosystems in Ramsey Creek Preserve, which was the first conservation burial ground in the United States. He actually explains it because he's a deep, deep, deep environmentalist at heart. Mm-hmm. He's like a walking genius when it comes to a lot of the environmental information that he has stored away in his head, along with all of his medical knowledge. He's a regular doctor in his hometown and runs the only small family practice.
Wow.
But he'll tell you that when after the New Deal and after the Great Plains were destroyed by farming and they were trying to restore those native wild grasslands to their native habitat, he will tell you that ecologists first found the native grasses growing most prevalently in small little cemeteries. And he thought, Billy Campbell thought, if this can happen by accident, why not by design? So why not create a space that's protected forever, where these species, these plants, can actually grow and flourish? Why not take death and create life from it?
Right.
And why not do that in a method that sustains and protects the land so that it cannot be gobbled up by a Walmart, a shopping center, condos. And it's most valuable to be able to do this type of a project in a large urban area like Nashville, especially now that Nashville's growing as much as it is, as most all cities across America are. It's very important that the people in the area have access to green space, not only for health and recreation, but it's also very important that we maintain and take care of what green space we have in this region, in this particular ecosystem. Wherever you live, here in Nashville, we have certain plants that aren't found anywhere else.
Right.
And every community has that. There's things that are special about the ecosystem and landscape in every hometown.
I think that's one thing that a lot of people, it's not that they have just forgotten or that they don't care. I think it's just that they're not aware,
Mm-hmm.
They're just not aware that there is, because the truth of the matter is, if you choose natural burial, then, you are really, your temple, your vessel, your body, or whatever you want to call it, then it can serve life around you, No
longer living, forever giving.
Right. So if you will, and I know I've seen this a lot recently, and I've had a lot of people, when I was telling a few people about the show tonight, I had a couple of people say, oh, yeah, I've seen that natural burial stuff. They put you in like a cremation thing in a cup, and then they bury you, and you become a tree. And I think that's a really cool idea, but my first thought is, and if you're listening tonight, you may or may not be aware that just a couple of weeks ago, or maybe a couple of months ago, they began, or they were in the process of enlarging an area at the zoo here in Nashville, and they unearthed 20 bodies, which they believe to be slaves. Now, I'm suspecting that when those people were buried, they had no idea that some, 100-plus years later, they would be dug up and moved. And when I think of a tree, and I think of the way that the land is gobbled up, I think, what if you plant a tree, and then they want to put a shopping mall there?
Mm-hmm.
It's gone.
Right. So the product that you're actually speaking about is called the BIOS urn, and it's an urn which is made of paper that you put the cremated remains inside, and then you take dirt, soil, just like potting a plant at home, and you place a seed in it, and you go out in the yard and you dig a hole, and you place the whole urn along with the dirt and seed in the ground, and you water it, and a tree grows. Well, it's a novel idea, and I'm glad to see that people are turning their attention towards trying to find solutions for environmental solutions for end of life.
Mm-hmm.
But in all reality, unless you are placing an urn or a tree like that in a protected, conserved area, it's quite possible that that tree, just like those graves that were disturbed at the zoo, could at some day be removed along with everything that's under it. You know, it's happening all over natural with our tree canopy.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we lose trees and trees. Others are planted, thank the Lord. But we lose a lot of our green space like that. So I would caution people from taking an urn that's made of paper with a tree in it and just burying it in the backyard, because you never know when the bank's going to foreclose on your house, or when a developer's going to come along and buy up all of the land, or when an interstate highway is going to come through, or, I mean, the list goes on and on and on.
Or when you own the land and you die and then your family doesn't want the land anymore.
Exactly.
You know, I mean, it's a novel idea, but it's kind of like if Aunt Sally's, 30 foot tall in the backyard.
Exactly.
And they don't want the house, they're not going to move that tree.
Don't waste your money on an urn like that. Invest your money, rather, in saving land forever for future generations by being buried in a conservation cemetery.
Yeah, yeah.
Naturally. Earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust.
Yeah. And the price alone is like, I mean, that's amazing to me, the difference in the two. And not that people would, choose that just because of the price, but because there's a lot of beauty in just the concept. If people can get out of their head long enough, because I think for some reason with a lot of people, and I know we're getting close to the end of our show here, but a lot of times I think people, because we're a society that it's so not okay to talk about dying for the most part, and when you do start that conversation, people get the heebie-jeebies, and they don't want to talk about it. They just want to kind of, like you said, they turn it over. I'll let my family deal with that. Well, newsflash, families don't particularly take they're not jumping for joy when they have to make these decisions.
They're not. And just to touch on something before we finish up, realistically, it is difficult to have the conversation, but it's very, very important to do it. And a lot of times people are going to say, well, I just want to be cremated. Just cremate me and scatter my ashes somewhere. Well, that's fine if that's what your true wishes are, but I charge everyone with the challenge. What's going to be best for your neighbors and the environment? What's going to be the best? Weigh the options between traditional burial, embalming, casket, vault, cemetery with plastic flowers, cremation, which generally is cremation, and natural burial, which is no embalming and burial in a nature preserve. I really think that when people start looking at what their options are, they'll move away from trying to escape the traditional funeral by cremation and move closer to natural burial. Now, if you wonder what where they all line up environmentally and where they line up cost-wise, environmentally, conventional funeral, embalming, casket, burial is the worst for the environment, followed by cremation. And the greenest method is natural burial. The most expensive across the board is, again, and on the bottom, most expensive, traditional funeral, embalming, casket, vault, burial. Next would be followed by, it really depends on where you're located at and what your prices are, whether it's going to be cremation or natural burial. But like I said, natural burial is right at around $3,000. Generally, below that, you're going to find cremation. Sometimes you'll find cremation as much as $5,000. So you'll have to look in your area to see what's best. So I would probably talk about as a tie for cremation and natural burial on cost. But really look into the different options and what's going to be best for you and what's going to be best for your family, and have the conversation.
Yeah, have that dialogue, open it, and have it, because
do the investigative work. It's not that scary.
It's really not.
It's not. We make it look that way.
We do.
And TB makes it look that way.
Filing taxes is far more scary.
Oh, gosh.
But driving through Atlanta is more scarier. But, I mean, that's just my personal opinion. Well, John Christian, it has been such a pleasure to have you here today. And tell folks that are listening where, again, they can find you or find more information if they have questions or anything.
You can find me online at lifebylife.com. Again, that's lifebylife.com. And you can also find our nonprofit that is called Larkspur Conservation, Larkspur like the flower. And we are developing that property here in Nashville. You can find us at larkspurconservation.org. And, I thank you so much for allowing me to be here. And I hope this has been helpful, and I hope it encourages everyone to open the dialogue with their friends and family.
Yeah, me too, because it is an important and it is an inevitable position that everyone will find themselves in. You know, I just wanted to throw out there before we do totally wrap this up. One of the things, too, you know, we talk about cemetery, traditional cemetery versus, you know, a natural cemetery. And when we're looking at years down the road, you know, we talk about preserving, you know, our planet for our kids and our grandkids and our grandkids' kids. The reality is, and this is not just about burial, this is about being environmentally conscious on multiple levels. If we don't take really strong proactive steps, we're going to screw ourselves. I mean, truthfully, you know, right down to, you know, the paper products and just everything, emissions, cars, all that stuff. So this is a wonderful, wonderful option for people who, you know, are in a mindset where they're open to talking about it, and, you know, and even if your family thinks you're crazy for thinking of a natural burial, you know, do your homework, because I know online and on your site you can find diagrams of what traditional looks like versus not. So it's not like, you know, they're putting you in a Pepsi bag and taking you out somewhere at Radnor Park and digging a hole.
Not at all.
It's a very respectful, very beautiful, very tender and loving way to honor your loved one and honor yourself for making the choice. So I'm off my soapbox now. And I do want to wrap this up, everyone. Thank you so much for listening tonight. And if you have questions, you know how to reach John Christian. Again, that's John Christian Phifer. I will be posting immediately when we go into archives the show in its entirety. So if you've tuned in halfway through and you want to hear all of this good information that he's been sharing this evening, you'll be able to do so. And if you have questions, you can reach out to him that way. You want to know more on the practice that I do of grief awareness and restorative living, reconnecting and reclaiming you can find me on Facebook at teripugh.com. You can find me on my website at www.teripugh.com. And you can email me at terry@teripugh.com. I'm keeping it pretty simple. So thank you for listening this evening. And until next time, please live well and increase the peace. Bye.
You've been listening to the Art of Living Well Radio Network, a subsidiary of Crowning Light Productions. For more information on all of our programs, go to our website, theartoflivingwell.tv. This is Gene Bogart saying thanks for listening to the Art of Living Well Radio Network. Radio to inspire enlightened living.
Okay, Kevin, for the grand prize of $1 million. What color is the White House?
I know this.
5 seconds.
Oh, switching to Geico could save you a bunch of money on car insurance?
Okay. Judges? That's true, Kevin. They'll allow it. Congratulations. You're a winner.
Woo! Geico, because saving 15% or more on car insurance is always a great answer.